Hello, and welcome to the Biomass Magazine podcast. I am your host, Anna Simet, and today I am chatting with Ben Hubbard, CEO of Nexus PMG. Ben, welcome to the podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So maybe to start, we'll have you tell our listeners a little bit about Nexus PMG, what the company does, and a little about yourself.
Yeah, certainly. Nexus PMG is a company that's been around for about 10 years. Myself and a couple colleagues that have longstanding EPC backgrounds founded the business, funny enough, while sitting in the deserts of Saudi Arabia. And we started the business as an advisory business. And today we still have that as a big anchor part of the business. We represent just north of 80 infrastructure funds, private equity firms, a lot of the tax-exempt municipal bond placement agents, et cetera, and their due diligence, from technical, operational, financial perspective from potential investments into kind of all things energy transition. So Nexus is rooted in the energy transition space, which 10 years ago was kind of the interesting, funky thing for a lot of groups, and now it's kind of the predominant theme. And so we were fortunate to kind of root ourselves in that space early on. So things like wood pellet production, biomass power generation, biofuels from RNG production to SAF to lubricants. We do a lot of insect agriculture and sustainable fertilizers. So just a lot of the things that are exploding in growth. We have our own development capital fund as well. So we do make investments into some of these development companies to help them grow and kind of fit a portion of the investment capital that is a bit more difficult for a lot of folks to find. And then we also have, as part of our advisory and services group, have expanded over the years into offering front-end engineering design services, site selection, a lot of co-development services for, commercial offtake agreements, negotiations, option contracts on land, all that kind of stuff. And so, we're really rooted in that. And then I'm pleased to say that recently we closed a large growth investment round backed by Ontario Power Generation's pension fund. For our pursuit of distressed asset acquisitions and turnarounds. So we recently purchased a biomass-fired power plant in Canada, in British Columbia, and have successfully turned that into a cash-flowing asset over the past 12 months, and we're looking to accelerate that strategy. So a lot of great things going on. We're really prideful of our impact on, reducing carbon emissions and our carbon footprint around the globe, and have a tremendous amount of growth in front of us, and super excited about it.
Yeah, I was looking at your project portfolio on your website, and it's an impressive range of biomass energy projects.
Yeah, it's been a fast and long 10 years all in one. But
yeah.
We got in early, and one wood pellet plant became two, and then all of a sudden there was a deviation from that. Well, if you know biomass, maybe you can look at this biomass power asset, and then before you know biomass, then can you look at this conversion technology that takes it to fuels, and then fuels diverse into, well, if you know how to make this fuel, then can you look at this RNG from AD, and we found some experts in that. So it just kind of, there's a lot of derivatives that come off of these project types because a lot of the feedstocks are similar and a lot of the outputs are similar, but then you got different kind of conversion technologies and process design in between. And we found that if we kind of mastered the front and back, that we could find the resources in between. And that's how we've kind of scaled our business, is by bringing in the subject matter experts and how to take, point A to point B, and then mastering kind of the front and back end.
Right. Interesting. So then let's talk about the state of the biomass economy. Can you give us kind of a general sense of where things are at?
Yeah, it's an interesting time. So I was actually just recently on with a group in Europe that's, really diving into the details of the new Renewable Energy Directive 3 that's pending. And you've got this interesting dynamic where, like, a lot of the sectors that leverage biomass, whether that's wood pellet production, biomass power generation, biomass gasification to fuels, with lots of growth in those sectors, and hydrogen production, you got a lot of exploding growth leveraging biomass, but you also have a political dynamic that has been and continues to kind of fight the perception component of biomass as being unsustainable, et cetera. But you kind of have this interesting dynamic where with the recent war in Ukraine and Russia, causing a surge in natural gas prices and cutting supply off from parts of the world. You've seen a surge in biomass usage. So people are solving a lot of their problems with biomass, and they're seeing the benefits of being able to rely on biomass. That's resulted in significant price hikes for wood pellets on the spot market, for even wood chips in the northeast part of the U.S., et cetera. But at the same time, you've got things like the Red 3, contemplating no longer allowing any part of the tree to be used for direct source of energy, et cetera. And so you've got it's in this fluctuation state where you got these competing forces of emerging biomass economy with a regulatory regime that's looking to potentially, make forced change within that ecosystem. And so you're seeing some of that change, and some of these companies like Drax and Enviva and others really start to embrace the impending change through things like direct air capture or carbon sequestration components, and trying to find ways to pioneer what will likely be the next generation of use of biomass. And so the push-pull relationship is right in the heart right now, and it'll be interesting to see how things play out over the next couple of years.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a good segue into my next question. So carbon's the buzzword. Find myself saying that a lot. There's a lot of buzz about biomass energy, carbon capture and storage. Kind of looking at this changing energy landscape, what do you think BECCS's impact could or might be on domestic use of biomass, including wood pellets?
Yeah, great question. So I think what we're seeing is there is a significant opportunity where, with things like the IRA that were recently pushed into play, you've got a lot of longer term view now for various different subsidy regimes and things in the U.S., like direct pay for 45Qs and all sorts of stuff that will allow businesses that can take biomass and convert into various things like SAF and various different types of fuel sources, et cetera, to be able to absorb the cost impact of using things like wood pellets in their things like gasification or thermochemical conversion processes to produce these things. Whereas prior to some of these, these programs being where they are today, and even recently for the matter with the IRA, really couldn't absorb the operating costs associated with putting in such a significant cost fuel into those systems. And so with that, you can actually now pencil out a lot of projects that you couldn't before that are economically viable, where you can, you could take wood pellets domestically, which is obviously more cost effective than the logistics component and freight to shipping overseas. You get a homogeneous feedstock, which is really a big necessity for things like thermochemical conversion. It just simplifies the process. And you can essentially qualify for a lot of the sequestration benefits like 45Qs and others. And so that will essentially, I think, over time, allow the things like wood pellet and wood chips and biomass economy to flourish within the U.S. so that over time, the export component to that industry in North America likely shrinks in percentage, because I think there will be a domestic use increase over the years as a result of that. So I'm really excited to see how the biomass economy and the carbon capture economy start to merge together, kind of anchored and overarching with this longer term kind of carbon tax in Canada, as well as carbon benefits to things like 45Q in the U.S. So it should be a pretty exciting time to see how those fields merge.
Yeah, absolutely. Great answer. So let's shift gears a bit to a different but yet pretty pressing topic in biomass right now: forest fires and government policy. Are we seeing any movement that will allow for more of this high hazard material to be used for bioenergy projects?
Yeah, I'd say over the past 24 months, at least from our lens, and I'm sure others would see it from different lens, but we are seeing some tremendous movement, particularly in North America. As I mentioned, we acquired a biomass-fired power plant up in British Columbia last year, so we had to get pretty intimate with those risks, and working with the First Nations tribes and understanding how are these risks being mitigated, and what are we actually going to do about this, both in the obvious place like California and parts of British Columbia, et cetera, and even Australia and other places and parts of the world now. But I think what we're finding is the government has has recognized that there's not only a political and pressing need to solve the issue from an obvious, safety perspective, but it's also realizing that there is economically viable ways to do so. And whether we like it or not, the reality is that there's always an economic component to these things. It's just the way of the world. So I think what we're finding is the economic component is coming into play now where, for example, like in the state of California, there are mandates now with various entities to remove and things like master stewardship agreements being put in place to remove that high hazard biomass material, but actually putting, public and private partnership programs in place and making sure that those groups are incentivized appropriately to essentially create the commercial outlets for that product. And that's always been the challenge is, where's it going to go? You're going to clean up the forest floors. You're going to take off all the high hazard residues, but it's got to go somewhere. And unfortunately, it has to go somewhere commercially viable. And so I think what you're finding is they've kind of starting to find their rhythm and their way to create these outlets through these programs with triple Ps and private entities to give them reason to go and create those commercial outlets, whether it's to, build wood pellet facilities to have them consume this fuel or to build hydrogen facilities using thermochemical conversion processes to consume this as a fuel source. And so I think we're going to start seeing, obviously it's pressing times, but I think over the next 5 years, you're going to start to see mobilization of harvesting businesses to be able to create, to start actually pulling a lot off the forest floor and start actually creating these outlets. And so those two worlds are merging together as well.
That's exciting. So Ben, in your opinion right now, what are the main roadblocks to energy transition projects getting funded?
So I think there's a lot of things that you can talk about in this field, but I think the one major thing is creditworthy counterparties and kind of contract durations on the commercial side. So what we see is every vertical kind of has different levels of advancement. So obviously like things like the wood pellet industry are fairly advanced relative to others. They have long-term contracts. There's trading desks. It's a much more mature market. But when you get into things like, hydrogen, direct air capture, even kind of things like food waste, to waste to value projects and municipal solid waste, what you're finding is there's still a lack of maturity kind of on the contractual side for the commercial to say, okay, well, no one's going to guarantee that they're going to bring, food waste to this facility for 10 years or have damages associated with that, and that it's not going to be waste management most likely standing on the other side. It's going to be a lot of local haulers. And so the large infrastructure funds, which is where the vast majority of the capital that will flow into growing these sectors struggle to underwrite those projects because of the kind of merchanty type risk that exists on feedstock or offtake, et cetera. And so I think what we're starting to see is there's a bigger emergence of things like trading desks that are aggregating these volumes and standing behind the credit risk. We're starting to see some of the earlier kind of more secular low carbon infrastructure funds like Generate and Equilibrium and Ember Infrastructure and folks like that getting way more nuanced into those risks so that they can take a view on those risks and start to, show that it can work. And I think the biggest roadblock is the biggest hurdle that roadblock is just finding ways to mature the creditworthy components and finding ways for bigger businesses and corporates and trading desks and aggregators and people with balance sheets and that can stand behind making sure that those commercials can be underwritten. I think that remains the biggest roadblock to a lot of these emerging sectors. And it's starting to mature, but as soon as that hurdle is crossed and people can get comfortable, then I think you're going to start seeing an explosion of growth in a lot of these sectors.
That makes sense. Well put. So you know what? I'm at the end of my questions. Ben, is there anything else that you'd like to add before we wrap things up?
Nothing too specific, just that, these times are very exciting, and there's a lot of reason to be excited for the growth in decarbonization of infrastructure. I believe that the IRA is going to make a tremendous impact, and it's very common for the public and even for a lot of funds to kind of focus on solar and wind and energy storage and electrification, because that's where the natural mindset kind of goes to, and it's kind of at the forefront of folks. But it's important for the public and for those in this, that are, passionate about, curbing climate emissions, to know that there's a tremendous amount of effort and a tremendous amount of opportunity happening in things like agriculture and, decarbonizing dairy farms and, producing renewable fuels with, leveraging things like sequestration to make carbon negative fuel products to replace jet fuel, traditional jet fuels. There's a tremendous amount of going on in hyper localized hydrogen production for backup power. And there's just a lot, insect agriculture is a space I'm fascinated with. And Nexus owns an interest in a company called Chipotle Farms that makes black soldier fly larvae and frass for fertilization that is a soil amendment. And there's so much going on outside of what we kind of know as a public as the traditional solar, wind, and renewable energy sources. But that's only a piece of the pie. And so I encourage those listeners and those out there to really also look at the other fields and just see that there is a lot of money flowing in. There's a lot of companies like Nexus out there trying to make an impact on the kind of what I'll call the non-traditional core infrastructures like solar and wind. And I think, and water is another one, wastewater management and water security. I just think there's a lot going on that is really exciting. And I'm really glad that you guys, bring a lot of focus to that. And I think that, the more we can push, the public can actually see that we are making progress, despite it sometimes feeling overwhelming that we may not be.
Right. Well, I think that's a fantastic ending point. Ben, thank you so much for coming on the podcast today. I really enjoyed our conversation.
Yeah, thank you for having me. And I look forward to seeing what you guys do in the future. It's some amazing work.
Yeah, same to you guys. And to our listeners, I hope you've enjoyed this podcast. Thanks for tuning in. Until next time.